This is chapter 25 on fluid, electrolyte, and acid-base balance. So looking at general body water content, infants are going to contain the most amount of water, up to 73% or more. This is due to their low body fat percentage and low bone mass. So this is what makes infants and babies kind of that squishy, dewy kind of appearance. Adult males about 60% water and females about 50% water. So females generally have higher fat content and less skeletal muscle mass, so they have slightly less water than males. And as you know, adipose tissue, fat tissue, would be the least hydrated of all, since it's hydrophobic. So total body water in adults averages around 40 or so liters. And then as we get older, that content, water content is going to decline to about 45%. So there's two main fluid compartments in the body. So we have fluid inside the cell and fluid outside the cell. So the intracellular fluid component or compartment is the fluid inside the cells that counts up for about 2/3 of our total body fluid. So when we say that we're about 70% water, this is due to all of our cells having the intracellular fluid inside of them. Extracellular fluid, or the ECF compartment, is the fluid that's outside of the cell. So it's going to make up only about 1/3. So we can further divide this extracellular fluid compartment into the plasma, which is just the fluid component of the blood, and interstitial fluid, or IF. So this is the space in between the cells. Okay, so it's not actually inside of a cell, so it's just in between the cell spaces. So we also lump in some other body fluids into this interstitial fluid category, so things like lymphatic fluid, cerebrospinal fluid, the humor fluids in the eye, so the aqueous humor, the vitreous humors of the eye, synovial fluid in the joints, serous fluid between those visceral and parietal membranes, as well as our gastrointestinal secretions. So this is just showing kind of relative comparison of these fluid compartments. So as I said, intracellular fluid makes up about 2/3 of our body fluids. Right? So interstitial fluid is pretty much everything else. It's outside of the body. So plasma and all of that interstitial fluid between the tissue spaces. So looking at composition of our body fluids, so water is the universal solvent. So most of our body fluids are water-based. So when we talk about solutes, we're talking about substances that dissolve in water. So if you have like a salt water solution, the water is the solvent and the salt are the solutes. So we can classify solutes based on whether they have a charge. So we classify these as non-electrolytes and electrolytes. So non-electrolytes are generally organic molecules that don't dissociate in water and include things like your glucose, lipids, creatinine, urea. But ultimately, they're non-electrolytes because they have no charged particles. So there's no kind of electrical component to them. So electrolytes make up the most of our solutes in our body fluids. So they do carry a charge and they will dissociate into ions in water. So again, things like salts, some acids and bases, some proteins. So they're called electrolytes because they're able to conduct electrical current. They're also going to have greater osmotic power than those non-electrolytes, meaning that they have a greater ability to cause fluid shifts because they're able to dissociate. So how we've talked about before, how sodium has a very strong kind of association with water. So sodium is going to have greater power to draw water into the cells than some non-electrolyte or organic components like glucose. So looking at comparison of our extra and intracellular fluids, so each will have kind of a distinctive pattern of electrolytes. So they have certain amounts of sodium and potassium and things inside and outside the cell. So with our extracellular fluid, the electrolyte contents are all pretty much similar, except for higher protein and lower chloride in the plasma. But our major cation and major player here is sodium. In the intracellular fluid, it's going to contain more proteins than the plasma. So it'll have lower levels of sodium, and its major cation will be potassium. Like we said, electrolytes are going to be more abundant than our non-electrolytes. So they're the most abundant in terms of numbers, just sheer numbers of solutes in the body. However, the bulk, as in taking up the most space, would be proteins, phospholipids, cholesterol, and triglycerides. So this is just due to these are actual large molecules, and these are just ions, right, or small chemical molecules. So our dissolved solutes, most of them will be in the plasma, so like your plasma proteins, those clotting factors, some in the interstitial fluid and the intracellular fluid. So this is just showing kind of relative amounts of different components of our body fluids, right? So as you see, sodium is by far the most abundant, the most prevalent in the blood plasma and in the intercellular fluid or interstitial fluid. Okay. Potassium is more prevalent in the intracellular fluid, right? So think back to Anatomy 1 when we talked about muscle contraction or nerve impulse generation, where we had that depolarization to initiate an action potential, right? So kind of the key trigger, the key point to that whole process was that sodium is going to influx inside of the cell and make it less negative, right? So this is why at a normal resting state, we don't want a lot of sodium inside the cell. So when sodium influx is inside the cell, that's going to trigger our action potentials. So our osmotic and hydrostatic pressures are going to help to regulate the continuous exchange and mixing of these body fluids. So this just means that water is able to move pretty much freely along its osmotic gradient. So osmosis can occur kind of naturally and passively. So all body fluid osmolalities almost always equal, or think maybe isotonic. So we want it balanced. We don't want any net shift or movement of water in or out of the cell, ideally. We want everything to be balanced. So osmolality just means the concentration. Right? So all our body fluids are pretty much isotonic or have about an equal concentration of solutes. So any change to these solute concentrations in these compartments can cause water flow or osmosis to occur. So if we have an increase in our extracellular fluid osmolality, or just the concentration of solutes, right, water is going to leave the cell. Okay? So extracellular, meaning outside the cell. So if there's more solutes outside of the cell, the water wanting to kind of reach equilibrium and balance those solutes out would leave the cell and cause the cell to shrink. Right? So this would be a hypertonic solution. So if we have a decrease in extracellular fluid osmolality or concentration, then water is going to enter the cell. Okay? So this means that inside of the cell is more concentrated, has more solutes than outside of the cell. So again, water wanting to kind of balance everything out and make it kind of equilibrium will enter the cell and cause it to swell. Right? So this would be your hypotonic solution. So looking at our water balance and the concentration or osmolality of our extracellular fluid, we want to try to keep balance with our water intake and water output. So we don't want to lose more water than we're taking in. So with water intake, most of the water is going to be taken in via ingested food and beverages, but we do get a small amount from metabolism. So this is called metabolic water. So a byproduct, or think maybe a waste product of our cellular metabolism, is water, right, as well as carbon dioxide that we exhale. So water output primarily comes from urine, about 60%. And then we have some other sources of water loss called insensible water loss, things like just where moisture evaporates through our skin and our lungs, as well as perspiration and feces. So the body tries to maintain our osmolality around 280 to 300 milliosmoles. Right? So we'll just call these units. You don't really need to worry about this. So 280 to 300 units for osmolality or concentration. So if we have an increase in that concentration or osmolality, that means that we need more water. So our body fluids are getting more concentrated. We need to dilute them down a little bit. So this would stimulate the thirst response as well as cause release of that ADH, antidiuretic hormone. So remember, ADH causes reabsorption of water, right? So if we need more water in our cells and our tissues, we'll release ADH so that way we don't let the water just pass through the body in the urine. Then vice versa, if we have a decrease in osmolality, so we're well hydrated, we have plenty of water and fluids, so this would inhibit ADH production. So we'll turn off ADH and let that excess water leave the body in the urine. So this is just showing kind of relative amounts of our body water, where they come from. So intake versus output. Right? So we said majority comes from just beverages, so drinking water and drinks. There is some water we get from foods. Right? So there's moisture in some of our foods unless you're eating something like beef jerky. And then a small amount of that metabolic water, that byproduct of the cellular metabolism. So average water output. Right? So remember, we want to try to keep them equal. So urine accounts for primarily most of our water output per day, 60%. That insensible loss via the skin and lungs, where it just kind of evaporates. So you can see some of this moisture loss when it's cold outside and you exhale and you can see your breath, right? That's your body losing a little bit of its moisture, right, through this insensible water loss. Sweat, perspiration can account for about 8%, and then feces about 4%. So our thirst mechanism is the main driving force for water intake. So it's governed by the hypothalamic thirst center in the brain. So we have some osmoreceptors in the brain, the hypothalamus, that are going to detect the concentrations of solutes in that extracellular fluid. So these can be activated by an increase in the concentration or the osmolality if you have a dry mouth, or decreased blood volume and pressure. So if we need to increase our blood volume, we can also take in more water, or we can stimulate that angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism. So the process of drinking water is going to inhibit or turn off that thirst center. So the brain detects we're taking in water, right? So it's going to turn off those thirsty signals to the body. So drinking water sends those inhibitory feedback signals by relieving dry mouth, also activating the stretch receptors in the stomach and the intestines. So this is also going to help to prevent overdilution. So we give the water enough time to enter the blood, so we don't just keep drinking and drinking until it enters the blood. So once the stomach detects water's entered the stomach, so it stretches a little bit, that's going to tell the brain that we've taken in water, so we can stop sending out those thirst signals. Okay. So this is just showing kind of the process for your thirst mechanism. So if we have an increase in the concentration, meaning we have a decrease in saliva production, which leads to a dry mouth. Right? So that's going to stimulate that thirst center to set the sensation of thirst to make you want to take a drink. So as you take a drink, the water is going to moisten the mouth, the throat, and stretch the stomach. So that's going to kind of negative feedback and go back and turn off that hypothalamic thirst center. Okay. So now the water is going to be absorbed from the intestines, and we're going to increase our plasma volume and decrease that concentration. Right. Similarly, if we have a low blood plasma volume, that's going to cause our blood pressure to drop. Right? So the kidneys detect that, so they'll kickstart that renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism, right? That can also stimulate our thirst centers. So the obligatory water losses help explain why we can't go without water for very long. So this is water loss that is unavoidable. So again, if it's obligatory, you're obligated, it has to happen. Right? So these include things like that insensible water loss we mentioned from the lungs and the skin and the feces. And then the sensible water loss would be from the urine. So the volume of urine that's excreted and its solute concentration are going to depend on an individual's fluid intake, diet, as well as water loss via other potential avenues. So maybe vomiting or diarrhea or excessive sweating. Right, so looking at the influence of antidiuretic hormones, so we've already talked about this hormone a lot, so just kind of a general review. So the water reabsorption in those collecting ducts of the nephron in the kidneys is going to be proportional to the release of ADH. Right? So remember we said ADH causes the collecting ducts to open up more of those aquaporins, so more water is able to be reabsorbed. If we have a decrease in ADH, it can lead to a dilute urine formation and a decrease in body fluid volume. So if we have an increase in ADH, that can lead to concentrated urine. So we have less fluid in the urine, it's going to be more concentrated because we are reabsorbing more of that water to increase the body fluids. So some of those osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus that monitor our solute concentration can also help regulate our ADH production. A few other factors that may trigger release of ADH, so any kind of large-scale changes in blood volume or pressure. So a decreased blood pressure would cause an increased ADH release. And then also potentially kickstart the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism. A decreased blood volume or blood pressure can be caused by things like intense sweating, vomiting, diarrhea, severe blood loss, prolonged fever, anything that causes you to lose a large amount of fluid in a relatively short period of time. So this is showing kind of the pathway of ADH production. So if we have an increase in concentration of our extracellular fluid, right, we can trigger those osmoreceptors, right? So they're detecting that it's too high. We have too many solutes in our fluid. So that's going to stimulate release of antidiuretic hormone, which targets the kidneys. Right? So we said it targets the kidneys to open up more aquaporins on the collecting ducts, which is going to increase our water reabsorption. Right? So instead of letting the water pass through out in the urine, we're going to reabsorb it to the blood. So it's going to result in decreasing that osmolality, increasing our plasma volume, and decreasing our urine production. So there's three principal abnormalities we can see with water balance. So one being dehydration. So this would just be excessive water loss due to things like hemorrhage, vomiting, diarrhea, sweating, right? So signs and symptoms of dehydration would be kind of like a cotton mouth, so your mouth's really dry, intense thirst sensation, and dry skin. May lead to weight loss, fever, confusion, or something called hypovolemic shock. So this is where the blood pressure is just too low to undergo tissue perfusion. So the tissues aren't able to receive the nutrients and things that they need from the blood because the blood pressure is just too low to kind of push those solutes across that capillary membrane. So during dehydration, we have excessive loss of water from the extracellular fluid. So that's going to make the osmotic pressure rise. So the concentration or osmolality in this extracellular fluid is going to increase. Right? So it's going to become a hypertonic solution. Right? So that means that the cells, the water in the cell, trying to dilute this extracellular fluid out, trying to balance the fluid between these two. So it's going to lose fluid and cause the cells to shrink. Another type of disorder with water balance would be hypotonic hydration. So this is essentially overhydration or water intoxication. So it can occur with renal insufficiency or rapid excess water ingestion. So maybe it's like some athletes that have been out in the heat and training and practicing all day, they get really hot and thirsty, so they just kind of chug a lot of fluid, a lot of water, Gatorade or whatever, very rapidly. So that kind of overloads the cells and the body fluids with this excess water. So this causes the concentration of the fluids to decrease, causing hyponatremia. So ultimately, we have a net osmosis of water going into the tissue cells, causing them to swell. So this can lead to severe metabolic disorders, nausea, vomiting, muscle cramps, cerebral edema, and even possibly death. So generally, it's easily treated though with a hypertonic saline. So we're going to force the water back into the cells with this hypertonic solution. Okay. So this figure is showing our hypotonic hydration. So excessive water enters into the extracellular fluid, causing it to become less concentrated outside than inside. So it's more concentrated inside the cell. So the water, wanting to kind of make everything balanced and equal, is going to move into the cell to try to dilute those solutes out. So it's going to make the cell swell and even potentially burst. So when we look at edema, technically it's not cell swelling, it's tissue swelling. So we'll have fluid buildup in the interstitial fluid, so in between the cell spaces. So the tissue as a whole becomes swollen. So this can impair tissue function by increasing the distance for diffusion of oxygen and nutrients. It could also impair function or cause pain by pressing on the nerves, right, making it difficult to move that body part. Could also be caused by increased fluid flow out of the blood or just a decreased return of fluid to the blood. So when we look at electrolyte imbalance, generally we're only talking about salt balance. Even though electrolytes include other substances, we primarily are just going to stick to the salt type of electrolyte. So salts help to control fluid movements, also provide minerals for excitability, secretory activity, and membrane permeability, like in voltage channels. So think sodium. So we've talked about sodium a lot and how water follows sodium. So sodium has a very strong kind of control over those fluid movements. Minerals for excitability. So think back to muscle cell contraction. It was the sodium that causes the depolarization and the action potential generation. So salts are able to enter the body generally by ingestion, some by metabolism, and they can be lost via perspiration, feces, urine, and vomit. So any type of severe electrolyte deficiency can cause craving. So generally if your body's missing something, it has a way to kind of crave it. So severe electrolyte deficiencies can prompt cravings for salty or sour foods. So this is common with things like Addison's disease. So we talked about this in the endocrine chapter. So we have too little aldosterone being produced. And since aldosterone causes sodium reabsorption, this means people with Addison's disease can't absorb enough sodium in their kidneys. So they're going to be deficient in those salts. So their body's going to crave the salty food to obtain that excess sodium they need. Pica is another disorder that can have to do with your electrolyte deficiency. So a person may eat weird non-food substances like chalk, clay, dirt. So this is generally caused by some type of mineral deficiency like iron. All right, so still looking at sodium. So sodium is the most abundant cation in the extracellular fluid. Right? So we said that overall there are about 300 milliosmoles, or just 300 units of solutes in the extracellular fluid. So about 280 out of those 300 is just sodium. Right? So almost entirely sodium is our primary electrolyte. So it's the only cation that has significant osmotic pressure. So again, going back to its relationship with water, it's able to help control water volume and water distribution because that water follows salt. So wherever sodium goes, water is generally going to follow. Okay. So changes in our sodium levels can influence things like your plasma volume, blood pressure, and those extracellular and interstitial fluid volumes. So looking at regulation of sodium balance, there are actually no known receptors that monitor just sodium levels in body fluids by itself. So we have to kind of indirectly monitor sodium and water balance through monitoring blood pressure and blood volume control mechanisms that we've talked about before. So any changes in the blood pressure, blood volume can trigger both neural and hormonal controls to help regulate that sodium content. So we've talked about aldosterone a lot. And its role in sodium reabsorption. So when aldosterone concentrations are high, we have lots of aldosterone, then the sodium is going to be actively reabsorbed in that distal convoluted tubule as well as the collecting duct. And then naturally water is just going to passively follow that sodium. So as a result, our extracellular fluid volume increases, but our urine output is going to decrease. So we're reabsorbing more water into the blood instead of letting it pass through the body in the urine. Vice versa, when aldosterone concentrations are lower, we're not going to be actively reabsorbing as much sodium. We're just going to let it pass out through with the urine along with that increased loss of water. So the water is going to follow the sodium out with the urine. So this is showing that sodium reabsorption mechanism, right, with aldosterone. So we have low sodium content, so that's going to trigger renin release from the kidneys, which stimulates release of angiotensin II, which stimulates the adrenal cortex, which releases aldosterone, which targets the kidney tubules to increase sodium reabsorption and potassium secretion. So as a result, we're going to restore those homeostatic levels of sodium and potassium. So remember with the hormones, they generally come in pairs. So what one does, there's another one that's antagonistic to do the opposite. So ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide, is going to be antagonistic to aldosterone. So it's released by the cells in the atria of the heart in response to stretch caused by increased blood pressure. So the higher the blood pressure, the more force and pressure it's exerting against the walls of the atria. So we have those stretch receptors or those baroreceptors that monitor the blood pressure through how much the atria is being stretched. So when the atria release ANP, it's going to cause a decrease in the blood pressure and blood volume by inhibiting that ADH and aldosterone production. So that's going to increase the amount of sodium and water that we are losing to the urine. And it's also going to promote vasodilation directly to decrease the blood pressure and also decrease production of angiotensin II. So angiotensin II was a very potent vasoconstrictor to raise blood pressure. So if we want to lower blood pressure, then we need to turn off the angiotensin II and dilate the blood vessels. So this is showing this pathway. So we had increased stretch due to increased blood pressure. We release atrial natriuretic peptide. Okay. It's going to turn off that renin angiotensin aldosterone mechanism. Okay. It's going to turn off ADH production so that we're not reabsorbing any excess water. Okay. So we decrease our sodium and water reabsorption and therefore our blood volume and blood pressure. Potassium is another important ion in the body fluids. So it's going to be important in affecting resting membrane potentials in neurons and muscle cells. So an increase in extracellular potassium is called hyperkalemia and can cause things like a decreased resting membrane potential and reduced excitability. A decrease in your extracellular potassium is called hypokalemia and can cause a hyperpolarization or even non-responsiveness of those neurons and cardiac muscle cells. So any disruption in the potassium levels in the heart can interfere with that electrical conduction, leading to sudden death. So when I was an undergraduate, I took an advanced physiology course. And part of the lab was we had to do experiments on live animals. They were anesthetized, but they were still alive. So kind of like the Physio X labs you guys do, where you inject rats with different hormones or whatever. We did stuff like that for real. But the downside was that at the end of every lab, we had to euthanize the animal. There was no saving him after everything we had done. So what we would do, we would inject potassium chloride directly into the heart, which would cause the heart to stop beating. So influence of aldosterone, we've already mentioned. So aldosterone stimulates absorption of sodium and secretion of potassium. So potassium and sodium are kind of antagonistic in that way. So when sodium comes in, potassium goes out, and when potassium comes in, sodium goes out. Okay? So these cells of the adrenal cortex are also very sensitive to potassium contents in the extracellular fluid. So if we have too much potassium, that can also trigger a release of aldosterone to increase secretion of that potassium. So we get rid of that excess potassium from the fluids. So really this means that potassium kind of controls its own extracellular concentrations via these feedback mechanisms of aldosterone release. So calcium phosphate are also some important components of the extracellular fluid. About 99% of your body's calcium is found in the bones as those calcium phosphate salts, where we store the calcium. So as we talked about before in the endocrine system chapter, parathyroid hormone is the major hormone of calcium balance. Right? So parathyroid hormone promotes an increase in blood calcium levels by targeting the bones. So those osteoclasts, those breakdown cells, are going to break down the bone tissue and release that calcium and phosphate back to the blood. It can also stimulate the kidneys to reabsorb more calcium instead of letting it just pass through with the urine. And then finally, we can stimulate the small intestine to increase our calcium absorption. So generally 98% of the filter calcium is due to that parathyroid hormone. So as long as our calcium levels are normal, then parathyroid hormone secretion will be turned off. Okay, so this figure is showing parathyroid hormone regulation. So say we have a low blood calcium level, so that will stimulate release of parathyroid hormone from the parathyroid gland. Right? And we said it operates by targeting the bone, so osteoclast activity to break down the bones and release that calcium to the blood. We can have the kidneys reabsorb more calcium instead of letting it pass through the urine. And we can increase calcium absorption in the small intestine. So calcium is important for blood clotting, cell membrane permeability, secretory activities, and neuromuscular junction excitability. So this is probably the most important role of calcium in its extracellular fluid. So remember from Anatomy 1, the calcium is what's going to bind to the troponin, right? So remember the actin, myosin, the filament. So the actin has those regulatory proteins blocking the binding sites. So once calcium is released, it binds to that troponin and opens up those binding sites so we can have our cross bridge formation and muscle contraction. Okay. So if you have hypocalcemia, that would be kind of not enough calcium. So that can lead to muscle tetany. A hypercalcemia can inhibit the neurons in muscle cells and may lead to things like heart arrhythmias or irregular beats. So looking at acid-base balance of the body fluids, so pH is very important to maintain that homeostatic level. So pH is going to be able to affect all of our functional proteins and biochemical reactions. So it has to be very closely regulated. So normal pH of body fluids in the blood's about 7.4, venous blood, interstitial fluid about 7.35, and intracellular fluid about 7. So it's neutral to slightly basic, but it's still a very narrow range for our homeostasis. So anything that goes above, say 7.45, could lead to alkalosis or alkalemia. Right? So the blood becomes more alkaline or basic. Right? If we go below, say, 7.35, it could lead to things like acidosis, where the blood becomes more acidic. So we have chemical buffers in the body to help resist changes of pH, to help maintain those normal homeostatic pH ranges. So essentially a buffer is anything that resists pH change. So it operates by either binding hydrogen if the pH drops or releasing hydrogen if the pH rises. So remember, pH is just a measure of hydrogen ion concentration. So if we have a lot of hydrogen, that's going to be very acidic. It's going to have a low pH. Right? If we don't have a lot of hydrogen, it's more basic, then it's a higher number pH. Right? So if we are adding hydrogens to our solution, that's going to make it more acidic. So the buffer will bind those hydrogens and try to take them out of the solution so that they don't affect the overall pH. And same thing, if we're losing a lot of hydrogens and our pH is becoming more basic, a buffer can release excess hydrogen ions to kind of restore our original pH. So there's three major buffering systems in the body. So we're not going to go into a lot of in-depth detail on these, but just know the three major types of buffering systems in the body are bicarbonate, phosphates, and proteins.